Hello everyone, this is Dr. West. So in the next two lectures, you are going to hear two different parts of chapter 11. One of them is going to be about a sensory system, specifically the somatosensory system, which is your sense of touch. Then in the next lecture, you're actually going to hear about a related system in your body, but it's actually not a sensory system. It's still peripheral, but it's actually sort of the opposite complementary system to your somatosensory system, and that is your sense of movement, or your ability to make movement and produce movement. And the reason I'm putting this together here, even though we have been talking a lot about sensory systems in this second part of the class, is because these two functions really go together. They need each other to work properly, right? You can't have proper movement without proper incoming sensory information, particularly about your sense of touch. Right? You're getting constant information about how your muscles are doing, your body position, exactly what's happening with your body and with your arm. Right? Also, if your body detects something on your skin, for example, that could potentially be damaging it, so think about when you touch something hot, for instance, you need to be able to move your body quickly so that you don't continue damaging that part of your body. So what you're going to see, right, is kind of this really neat combination, right, of skills, because your somatosensory system is constantly interacting with and feeding information to, right, the brain, which can then immediately feed information back out if necessary to produce a movement. Let me also sort of show it to you in this way. So what you see here is an illustration of sort of a slice through a spinal cord. And again, coming from your peripheral nervous system is a whole series of incoming sensory information, in this case from your sense of touch, that will come into your spinal cord. Right? Some of that information will immediately be able to give information to motor neurons, and this is really helpful. All right, and actually there is actually what we call an interneuron step here, but it will very quickly be able to give information to a motor neuron. The motor neuron can immediately send information back out, for example, to a muscle in your arm. For example, if you were touching something hot, so that you can immediately withdraw your arm and your hand so that you would stop touching that thing that's hot. All right. Other parts of that incoming sensory information might cross over. Some of that information is ultimately going to be sent on to the brain. This is also why when you touch something that's hot, you've actually usually withdrawn your hand before you actually have the sensation, the actual experience in your brain of, ow, that hurt, ow, 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 ow. All right. So again, these two systems are very much related. Also, we also know that you have incoming motor information coming from the brain that is going to come down so that you can then send out motor information if you have consciously decided that you do want to move something. So again, lots of things are happening, but are coming in and going out at the level of the spinal cord. So again, there is a lot of overlapping relationship between the somatosensory and the motor system. Now, hopefully you remember this from the first unit. If you remember, in the occipital lobe here, that's the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe here, right at the border between parietal lobe and frontal lobe, right, you sort of had these two overlapping layers, right? You had the primary somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex. Right? So there is a reason that these two cortices line up with each other. That's that you have all of this incoming sensory information and outgoing motor information that can get so coordinated with each other, so that when you do want to move something, right, you have that ability to sort of have that nice overlapping communication of information. So let me take one more step back, and then I'm going to show you some of the pre-recorded lecture again. But, oops, excuse me, going the wrong way. So again, today we're going to be talking, in this first lecture, we're going to go over the actual sensory system of touch. And you're going to see the same pattern that you've been seeing. So we'll talk about the kinds of touch receptors that are in your skin. We'll talk about how the sense of touch also will eventually be sent to the brain. It will go through the thalamus. We'll talk about the primary sensory cortex up there in that part of the somatosensory lobe, oh my God, parietal lobe, gosh, where did my brain stop there for a minute? And then we'll talk about some secondary sensory processing and association cortex. What's really neat though, right, is when your brain initiates a movement, right, versus like a simple reflex that happens at the level of the spinal cord. But when the brain actually decides, I want to make a movement right now, you sort of see this same pattern, just kind of in reverse. All right, so it sort of looks like this. So let me show you what that sort of looks like. All right, see how it's kind of in reverse. You start at the level of sort of association cortex, so your brain has been putting things together and it's like, oh, hold up, might need to make a movement here, and eventually you're going to send that information out using motor cortex. All right, it doesn't exactly go through the thalamus, but you have something that's sort of similar in the brainstem called the brainstem motor nuclei. And then ultimately that information gets sent out not to a sensory receptor, but to a receiver, all right, which would be, in this case, a muscle. All right, so again, a very similar kind of pattern, just sort of the opposite direction of flow. So pay attention to this. Again, this first lecture is somatosensory. The next one that you'll watch is going to be for the sense of movement. Now, one other thing I wanted to go ahead and point out here, because what you're going to find is you're going to get to the end of this unit 2 and you're going to be like, Dr. West, you seem to have left out a couple of our senses, because I can taste stuff and I can smell stuff, and you seem to not have addressed that. Haha, very keen eye, everyone. Good thinking. And that is true. I have not addressed that. And I'm not going to yet either. We are going to save that for the third unit. And I am going to put that in with what we call motivated behavior. And if you think about it, the number one time that you taste things is usually when you're eating. So I'm going to talk about your sense of taste when I'm also talking about feeding behaviors and eating and motivated eating behavior. And at the same time, I'm also going to talk about smell, because it is also what is called a chemical sense, because what you're detecting is the chemicals that are in your food, as well as the chemicals that are in the air and things like that. So we'll talk about that when we get there. So don't think I have neglected those two senses. I'm just postponing those into the third unit. So today, again, we're going to cover somatosensory system. The next lecture, we will cover the sense of movement, well, not really the sense of movement, but the experience of movement, that again runs very heavily with your sense of touch. All right, guys, talk soon.
Welcome to lecture 5 of section 2. We're going to cover somatosensory sensation and perception. It's also known as touch. It is the last sense that we will cover in this section. Just like vision and hearing, we follow the same process when we have touch or somatosensory sensation. You have receptors, then you go to the thalamus, then you go to your cortex where you have primary, secondary, and association. One of the things I often struggle with when I teach this class is the order in which I discuss somatosensory and movement. And the reason why I struggle is because the book actually has movement first. But based on feedback that I've received from students in the past and kind of my own teaching and comfort and in the flow that I think makes sense, we actually move somatosensory up in front of it because it's a sense, so you're keeping that same pattern. What you'll notice is that movement uses a very similar pattern, however, it goes the opposite direction. Right? It exits, the information exits the central nervous system. So it goes from secondary, primary motor cortex through the motor nuclei in the brainstem and then to the muscles. So it's an opposite. We're going to talk about first, though, somatosensory, which is the sensation. It's the arriving information. It is the afferent information. So just to touch on that again, just to remind you that information that is arriving into the central nervous system is afferent, and then the information to create movement, where you exit, things that leave the central nervous system, that's efferent. And these systems are parallel, and they do work closely together, always presented together. So as we're working on this and gathering the two, understanding the two systems, the spinal cord plays a critical role in getting the information from our body, from our periphery into our brain. Here in the diagram you can see, or in the picture here, you can see that the red arrows are the sensory arrows are representing the sensory neurons, and they are bringing information in. So that's the afferent, bringing in information. And then the dorsal, that's the dorsal side. And then the ventral side, which is the one that's bringing information out to the muscles, would be your efferent, which is also the motor side. This is laid out. These tracks are laid out. It is parallel, simple structure so that we can monitor how these things occur and how these communications interact. When we're talking about the cortex and we're looking at the somatosensory and motor systems, if you recall in section 1, in that picture of the brain where you had to memorize the different, be able to point out the different lobes, there was a central sulcus. Here it's labeled fissure, but we call it the central sulcus. Just a slight change in terminology. Why did you have to memorize that? Or why did you have to be able to point that out? And part of that's because now it's going to be a nice identifying piece for you, where that is the division, the central sulcus is the division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So the frontal lobe is here, which is the motor cortex, represented in the blue, and the parietal lobe, or the somatosensory cortex, is in this pink color, is lining the other side of the central sulcus. And these do run parallel to each other. So information coming in, right? That's for the somatosensory, that's this pink side. What you notice, or what you may notice, so I'm going to point it out to you, is that layer 4, which is the sensory input, is much thicker in the somatosensory cortex than it is in the motor, because that's not its job, right? The motor cortex has much larger outputs, divisions of its cortex, because that's its job. Over here, not so much. There is output because the parietal lobe does integrate with many areas of the brain. But isn't that cool? How we can see the thickness and the striations are different based on their responsibilities. Our brain is plastic, and it does adjust to its abilities or its demands of its job. So the somatosensory system is responsible for allowing our brains to understand where our body is and what it's doing, what it's feeling. It helps us orient us where we are with regards to our spatial environment. It helps us distinguish between what is us versus what is outside of us, and then also the objects that are around us and what we can do with it. Again, touch and movement are intrinsically linked. We're going to start with the receptors. There are lots of different types of receptors, and their density ranges dramatically depending on the type and duty of that part of your skin. Our hands, highly dense number of receptors, and also high sensitivity. There are 3 types of main receptors. There's nociception, which is responsible for picking up things like pain and temperature, also would give us itch. Then there's hapsis, and those are responding to or are activated by touch and pressure and vibration. This is when people think of touch, this is usually what they're thinking about. And then proprioception, that is receptors that are located at points of muscle insertion, so like tendons and ligaments, that are picking up changes in that muscle and joint, which provides feedback to the brain about where your arm is in regards to the rest of your body. So as I mentioned, there's many receptors. I don't expect you to memorize each one of these different types here. I do want you to understand that there are 3 major types: the nociception, the hapsis, and the proprioception. One of the things that are interesting or unique is that there are levels of adaptation that occurs in these receptors, and that has to do with how they respond or what they respond to. The slow adaptation receptors are ones where if the stimulus is present, it will continue to send the message. Rapid adapters are ones that if a message is sent, or if there's a message being sent, like you're touching the table, the rapid adapters will stop firing after a period of time because they adapt to the fact that you're touching something. And then when you remove your hand from that table, then those rapid adapters again send another information to the brain saying your hand's off the table. So the points of change are where rapid receptors are really important for sending information about. Slow adapters are responsible for picking up all types of stimulation. It's what tells your brain your hand is still against the table. Hope that helped. Sometimes people have a tough time with that. Here it is in more words. The rapidly adapting are ones that allow us to understand the beginning or the end of a stimulus, and the slow adapter are ones that are activated as long as that sensory stimulus is coming into the body. All right, so let's now move into the thalamic nuclei and the primary and somatosensory areas. To get information from the periphery to the brain, it uses the spinothalamic tracts. So spinal cord, thalamic to the thalamus. It's telling you exactly what's happening, and there are two different branches of it. There's the dorsal and there's the ventral. Outlined here, you've got this dark solid line. That is the dorsal spinothalamic tract, and that brings up hapsis and proprioception information. The dashed line here is responsible for conveying the nociception, and that is the ventral spinothalamic tract. So the information, when we're talking about processing the data, processing the information coming into the brain, like vision and hearing, the contralateral side of the brain is responsible for doing much of the perceiving, meaning that the right hand information, what it's doing, is being sent and being processed by the left side of the brain. One of the things you'll notice with these two different tracks is that where the crossover happens, where the information switches from the right side to the left side or left side to the right side, happens at different places. For the dorsal root, it does not switch over until it gets into the medial lemniscus part of the brainstem. However, the ventral spinothalamic tract actually crosses over at the level of the spinal cord when it first enters and then goes up. So let's look at this in some words. So the dorsal spinothalamic tract, again, like I said, carries a haptic and proprioception. The information crosses sides or becomes contralateral at the medial lemniscus. And then it goes into the thalamus, which is the ventrolateral nucleus. And then it shoots it out into the somatosensory cortex primarily, and some of it goes to the motor cortex that's feeding information about where things are. The nociception is being brought to the brain via the ventral spinothalamic tract, and it crosses over. It becomes contralateral at the level it enters the spinal cord. And then the information goes up the side of the spinal cord and joins the information from the hapsis and the proprioception in the medial lemniscus. It also goes to the ventrolateral nucleus, but it's only projected into the somatosensory cortex. Its job, nociception, is to convey and share information on pain. Here's the picture again. Let's review it again. You have the dorsal spinothalamic tract, which brings information in on the dorsal side, goes up, crosses over at the medial lemniscus, then goes to the thalamus, then goes to be processed. That is hapsis and proprioception. Then you have the ventral spinothalamic tract, and that is one where the information comes into the spinal cord, becomes contralateral at the level it enters, and then goes up and follows the same track as the other information. These are two helpful videos. They're Neuroscience in 2 minutes. It talks about both the dorsal and ventral spinothalamic tracts very quickly. It does go into much more detail than I'm expecting you to understand it at. So make sure when you're going back and forth between the two, you really focus in on what's on the slides versus what's in the video.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss touch and the dorsal column's medial lemniscus pathway. Somatosensation involves sensations from the body. When these sensations come from the external environment, they are picked up by receptors in the skin called cutaneous receptors. There are several different types of cutaneous receptors, each designed to respond to specific types of touch sensations like pressure, pain, or vibration. In this video, I'll discuss signals that involve information about fine touch and vibration. I'll cover pain in a separate video. The main pathway that carries information about touch to the brain is the dorsal column's medial lemniscus, also called the posterior column's medial lemniscus. This pathway also carries information about proprioception, or the position of the body in space. These signals come from proprioceptors in the muscles and joints. Fibers in the dorsal column's medial lemniscus leave cutaneous receptors or proprioceptors and enter the spinal cord via the dorsal roots. They travel up the spinal cord to the medulla in one of two fiber bundles within the dorsal columns, the fasciculus gracilis, which carries information from the lower half of the body, or the fasciculus cuneatus, which carries information from the upper limbs and torso. In the medulla, the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus synapse on the next neurons in the pathway in areas called the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, respectively. It is from these nuclei that the second part of the pathway arises, a fiber bundle called the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus leaves the dorsal column nuclei and quickly decussates or crosses over to the other side of the brain before traveling up to the thalamus, where it synapses in a part of the thalamus called the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, or VPL. A third part of the pathway arises from the thalamus and travels up to an area of the cortex called the postcentral gyrus, which contains the main sensory area for touch in the brain, the somatosensory cortex. Specific parts of the somatosensory cortex receive signals from specific parts of the body, an arrangement that is known as somatotopic. Information about the nature and location of the sensation are integrated in the somatosensory cortex, where the conscious perception of the sensation begins. Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss pain and the anterolateral system. Pain begins at nociceptors, cutaneous receptors that are specialized to detect noxious stimuli like extreme pressure, very hot or cold temperatures, or tissue damage. When activated, nociceptors send a signal to the spinal cord. The signal will be sent to the brain on pathways that make up what is known as the anterolateral system. The anterolateral system consists of 3 major pathways: the spinothalamic, spinal-reticular, and spinal-mesencephalic tracts. The spinothalamic tract can be considered the main pathway for transmitting pain information to the cerebral cortex. It is involved in the awareness and recognition of where in the body a painful stimulus is occurring. Neurons in the spinothalamic tract carry pain information from nociceptors to the spinal cord, then immediately synapse with a second neuron that quickly decussates, or crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord before traveling up the spinal cord. These fibers proceed to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, where they synapse with another neuron that carries the pain information to the somatosensory cortex. The function of the spinal reticular tract is not very clearly defined, but it may be involved in changes in the level of attention in response to pain. The fibers of the spinal reticular tract follow the same path as the spinothalamic tract, but they also project to areas in the reticular formation, which is a network of neurons found throughout the brainstem that are involved in a wide range of functions, including attention and consciousness. The spinomesencephalic tract, also known as the spinotectal tract, plays an important role in the control and inhibition of pain. Fibers in the spinomesencephalic tract follow the same path as the spinothalamic tract, but they synapse in an area of the midbrain called the periaqueductal gray. When neurons in the periaqueductal gray are stimulated, they can activate a natural pain suppression system that involves the release of endogenous opioids, which are substances that are produced by the body and have pain-killing effects. The release of endogenous opioids and other neurotransmitters leads to the inhibition of the pain signal in the spinal cord and naturally produced analgesia.
So the somatosensory cortex, there's a primary and there's a secondary. Primary receives the information from the thalamus, and then it sends the information to the secondary to help being processed and helping us understand and identify what's happening. Here's a nice little schematic for you. Now this primary somatosensory cortex is divided up into subunits, and I'm going to talk about those. Work that was done by Penfield and other colleagues trying to understand if particular parts of our body are mapped onto our somatosensory and motor areas. So are there certain places in the brain where our finger information is being processed? Are there places where our big toes information is being processed? As it turns out, there is. And we're gonna talk about that in a moment. But first, I want you to recognize or see that the information that comes from our muscles, our skin, their joints, the pressure, that type of thing, those are processed in sub-areas. There are sub-layers of that primary somatosensory cortex. There's a layer, a thin layer, that covers muscles, the slow adapting skin, the fast adapting skin, and then the joints and pressure. Now this is the topographic or the homunculus idea, where on this portion of the cortex, information about the tongue is being processed. So the tongue is a primary sensory collector of information. Think about infants, they put things in their mouths when they're young because it's part of exploration. We have a lot of texture and food sensitivities due to things like texture. So the tongue plays a big role in sensation. And then this is a profile of the face. You can see how big the lips are. The lips, also another major sensitive area. And you've got your hand, and then into your arm and your trunk. Notice how little space is there. Think about it. We don't use our side or our abdomen to feel what objects are, right? Those, they don't require a lot of space in our brain for processing that kind of information. The information typically gets sent to the brain and follows this direction. Muscles, then the skin adaptation, and then joints and pressure. That's how the information is starting to be processed and then combined.
Homunculus. If you've heard that word, it probably wasn't in the context of psychology. A monster in Dungeons & Dragons, a song by the Maybe Giants, the bad guys in Full Metal Alchemist, a novel by James Blaylock. It's Latin for little man, and in psychology, it refers to a kind of sensory map of the human body, a depiction of what we'd look like if each of our parts grew in proportion to how much we sense with them. Witness! Look at this dude. His ham hands could rip off a car door. I mean, like, if he could lift them, which he couldn't. Is this what we're supposed to look like on the inside? This freaky thing illustrates the weighted significance of our sensory receptors. His disproportional hands are monstrous, for example, because we primarily touch the world with our hands, not our elbows, so our hands are extremely sensitive. His mouth, meanwhile, is huge because we also have a ton of sensory receptors in our tongues and lips. It's what we use for tasting food and for sucking face. As we continue our exploration of how we both sense and perceive the world, the homunculus, while kind of freaky, is actually a pretty attractive model for understanding how our bodies interact with the environment. How we smell it with our outsized nose, taste it with our ridiculous Mick Jagger lips, and touch it with our enormous Donkey Kong hands. So join me as we get to know the hideous little creature within you.
The reason why movement and somatosensory are so intertwined is because when we move, our somatosensory sensation or movement of our body is being picked up and is going to confirm and or counterbalance what we just did. These systems can be disrupted and can start to degrade. Stroke obviously is one of those things that can cause it, but there's also neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's is a big one. We're going to talk about that later on, but where these systems start to break down, this cross communication between the two. And then apraxia, that is the inability to create voluntary movement. Again, this falls under that Parkinson's type behavior, especially very far along or highly progressed Parkinson's. They have the inability to actually carry out the plan of a voluntary movement. The parietal lobe, if you remember, both vision and auditory send information there as part of their association cortex. This is part of their processing of the environment. That information gets dumped into the parietal lobe, where the touch information gets dumped from the primary to the secondary, and this is where information is starting to come together, providing that full picture and or the completed movements that we've had. Here's an example. Here's the occipital right dorsal stream sends information to the somatosensory. Here is your auditory, right, the primary auditory area, then the secondary, and it sends information to the posterior pathway to the parietal lobe, which then pulls in here and helps bring all these pieces together and helps really create a full picture of what's happening in your environment. At this point, I like to talk about pain, given that we're talking about somatosensory and nociception is a part of the pain, it's part of the touch sensation. I also like to touch on it just because as a society, I feel like we really try to avoid it, but it's hard to because it's a necessary evil of life. Everybody experiences pain. It is a common human experience. It's one of the most common reasons for why people go to the emergency room or even see their physicians. And pain has many causes. We cannot get into all the details that we need to. However, things on a very basic level is that we do know based on individuals who are born without pain receptors or pain receptors that are dysfunctional, we find that they have disformities and they also can have some very serious injuries because they are getting no feedback that what they're doing is not good. That sitting in that position or holding that position for that long is not a good idea. They often have a very short life expectancy because they take risks that people who have pain sensation wouldn't do. Pretty naive in our understanding about pain because there are causes that are acute. There's damage, there's a broken bone, there's a cut finger. Those are very acute types of injuries that once they're healed, they usually go back to functioning normal and there's no pain. However, sometimes that doesn't clear up and the pain remains and people suffer when there's nothing organically wrong with them. Like there's no cut, there's no active healing going on, which is difficult. So pain, we don't understand very well as a society and we don't treat it well either. And one of the reasons why is because we think it's a pharmacology problem and in reality it's more than that because pain is a perception. They literally are picking up releases from the surrounding areas. from the surrounding cells, whatever they're releasing. So it could be cytokines, could be other peptides, other messengers that are being released. Ventral spinothalamic tract is the main way for this information to get to the brain. However, one of the things we did find, they've done this in animal studies, and I don't believe it's ever been done in humans, but maybe they did trials, that if you just cut that ventral spinothalamic pathway, you would think if that's the cause, if that's sending the information, if you shut that off, then that will stop the pain. Or if you block it, nerve blocks. And what we find is that doesn't work. The pain is not as simple as the receptor is detecting it, it's sending the information to the brain's perceiving it. What we find is that the brain is actually very powerful in dealing with pain and the perception of it, and can perceive pain in a situation where there's actually no stimulus. That's something interesting to think about. The gate theory of pain has to do with how the two tracks, the two spinothalamic tracks, interact with one another. The haptic proprioception, or the dorsal spinothalamic tract, when it's stimulated, can reduce pain perception. It can slow down or turn off the ventral spinothalamic tract. Kind of an interesting way to think about it. So here's a picture so you have an idea. So here are your hapsis and proprioception. They are large myelinated nerves, where information goes up the dorsal side. It also sends a projection over to this interneuron that can influence the ventral spinothalamic tract, one where we have pain. These nerves and neurons are small and they're unmyelinated. If you go back to section 1, what's the difference between myelinated and unmyelinated? Myelinated have the fatty wrapping around the axon that allows the action potential to jump and move much more quickly. The unmyelinated doesn't. You have to have the action potential at every portion of the axon, so it moves more slowly. So the hapsis, or in nociception, when they're activated and stimulated, they will activate this interneuron. So this little plus means will activate it, which will then cause a shutdown of this pathway, the ventral spinothalamic. So that's how the gate theory works. This gate right here is key. And if this system is sending information on it, it's going to shut down the feeling of this process. You'll notice, though, that if the pain is substantial and long-lasting, the interneuron is affected by this pathway, which then shuts off this neuron, which then removes this no sign and allows the communication to go. It's kind of interesting. The best way to experience this, and you may have felt it yourself, is that when you stub your toe, you feel the fact that you've jammed your toe into something before you actually feel the pain. And what's the other thing we do when we have something that hurts? We go down and we rub it. We touch it. That touching is using the dorsal spinothalamic tract to override the pain track. This is why people use massage and acupuncture and those types of, and like baths and that type of stuff. Those are all things that activate the haptic and proprioception to shut off the pain message. So that interneuron plays a major role. We do know that there are opiates will bind with it. There are ways of using electrical stimulation, another process of getting that haptic and proprioception systems activated. One of the things that we've learned with pain is if we can figure out how to lessen the pathways from the forebrain to the brain stem. Using the gate theory as a way to treat pain. The interneuron, that is that gatekeeper, it uses opiates to reduce the pain sensation. And that's why we use opioids or opiates to treat pain, because they mimic that effect. The electrical stimulation at the muscle, which sends the confusing message of the haptic and proprioception being activated, there's also places in the brainstem that we know if we stimulate, we can, so think about the medial meniscus, where we can confuse or shut down the brainstem pain pathways, pain gates. Perception's lessened, despite the signal being picked up at the periphery as being intense, because we can shut it off at the brainstem. It shuts down the perception of it, not the activation. That all stays kind of the same, but the actual perception, once it gets from the thalamus to the brain, to the cortex, that's where the perception's lessened, because it's blocking some of the full signals. So that's the end of the pain.
The withdrawal reflex is an automatic response enacted to withdraw a limb from a painful stimulus. If, for example, you were to touch a hot stove or step on a tack, the withdrawal reflex would cause you to pull your arm or leg away from the painful stimulus without having to consciously plan to do so. The intensity of the reflex is proportional to the intensity of the painful stimulus, so a very hot stove would cause a more rapid and forceful withdrawal than a mildly hot stove. The withdrawal reflex is a polysynaptic reflex, as it uses neurons called interneurons to pass signals from sensory to motor neurons, creating multiple synaptic connections. The reflex begins when a painful stimulus is detected by receptors called nociceptors, which are specialized to detect noxious stimuli. The activation of nociceptors leads to an action potential in a sensory neuron, which carries the signal to the spinal cord, where multiple reflex pathways are activated. One of those pathways excites a motor neuron that activates the flexor muscle in the limb, causing the limb to withdraw from the painful stimulus. Another pathway inhibits the motor neuron that normally activates the opposing extensor muscle in the limb. This will keep the extensor muscle from counteracting the attempt of the flexor muscle to pull the limb away. Another pathway crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord and causes the opposite response to occur in the opposing limb. In other words, the extensor muscle in the opposing limb will be activated and the flexor muscle will be inhibited. This is sometimes called the crossed extension reflex, and it is enacted for postural support. If, for example, you are withdrawing your foot from a painful stimulus, then the other leg needs to be prepared to hold your weight.